The first bite mark looked like an axe wound. That's what the men told themselves at a distance, because an axe wound is familiar, and familiarity is how you keep working when the mountains are trying to freeze you and the contracts are trying to starve you. But when Foreman Petru got close enough to put lantern light on it, the lie fell apart. The oak trunk had been chewed. Not gouged, not split, not hacked. Chewed in a crescent, deep enough that you could fit both fists into the hollow. The wood fibers were crushed and combed the way they are after teeth. The bark around the bite was polished, as if a mouth had pressed there and worked patiently. And above it, higher than any man could reach without climbing, there was another bite. Then another. A ladder of crescents up the trunk, each one as clean as the last. Petru raised the lantern and felt the flame shiver. Because oak doesn't get bite marks in the Carpathians, unless something has decided the forest itself is food. Behind him, one of the sawyers whispered, "A bear." Petru didn't answer. Bears tear, bears claw. Bears don't leave perfect half-moons in hard oak, evenly spaced like steps. And then the wind shifted. Not stronger, not colder. Just different, as if the air up the slope had been exhaled from a deeper place. The lantern's light reached further for a moment and caught something between the trees. A shape tall, pale, and still. Not a man. Not an animal. It stood where the fog was thickest, head too high, shoulders too broad, the outline wrong against the timberline. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It had already made the men stop. Petru felt the oldest fear a mountain can teach you, the fear of being watched by something that doesn't have to hurry. He tried to swallow and found his throat dry. Then the shape made a sound. Not a roar. A slow grind like teeth meeting wood. And Petru understood the bite marks weren't old evidence. They were a message. I am here. And I have time. If you click away now, you keep the comforting version of the mountains. Wolves, bandits, weather, problems you can shoot or outwalk. But if you stay, you'll follow what Petru followed. Because in the winter of 1879, a logging camp at the Carpathian timberline stopped sending timber downriver. No bodies were found. No fires were seen. Just abandoned saws and silent huts, and oaks with fresh bite marks climbing into the fog. In 1879, the Carpathians didn't need monsters. The mountains were enough. They killed with distance, with snow, with sudden silence that made men walk too far without realizing they stopped hearing birds. They killed with hunger most of all. Hunger was the real foreman up here. Hunger made men take bad jobs, make bad camp choices, and keep working when the smart part of the mind was begging them to stop. Petru had taken the contract because there wasn't another. The timber buyer down in the valley didn't care about superstition or weather, only output. Oak and pine, dragged to a river bend, chained into rafts, sent down. A clean line of profit that ignored how the forest fought back. The camp was placed high, close to the timberline, where the oaks grew tougher and the ground turned thin and stony. It was an ugly place to build huts, wind funneling through the passes, nights that tightened your chest. But it was close to good trees. And good trees were money. Petru ran the camp with 8 men, but only 3 mattered enough to remember, because the others blurred into labor the way winter blurs days. Mihai, the camp cook, older than the rest, who spoke less the higher they climbed. Vogel, a sawyer from the west with hands like iron, and a laugh that disappeared after the first week. Andre, a young hauler who still believed the mountains were a story and not a sentence. They built their huts, they set their tools, they started cutting. For the first 10 days, everything was hard but ordinary. The forest screamed when trees fell. The men drank cheap spirits at night and listened for wolves that sometimes came close enough to make the dogs whine. Snow came in thin sheets that made the world quieter and the work slower. Then the camp started losing things. Not tools, not timber. Food. A sack of flour gone from the store hut without a broken latch. Smoked meat missing from rafters, hooks empty. No tracks outside the hut except their own boots and the occasional paw print of dogs. Mihai blamed rats, but his voice didn't carry conviction. "This isn't a rat," he said finally, late one night staring into the cookfire. "Rats take crumbs, this takes decisions." Petru frowned. "You saying someone's stealing?" Mihai didn't look up. "I'm saying something is hungry," he replied. Vogel laughed then, a sharp sound meant to slice the tension. "Everything is hungry," he said. "That's why we're here." Andrei tried to join the laugh, but it came out thin. 2 nights later, the first dog went missing. Not killed, not found, just gone from its rope. The rope was still tied to the post, cleanly severed, not frayed, not snapped. Severed as if cut by something that didn't need a knife. Petru inspected the post at dawn and found a smear on the wood. Not blood. A greasy film, faintly pale, that caught the light like wax. He touched it with a glove and felt it tack slightly. It smelled like old animal and damp bark. Mihai saw his face and said quietly, "Don't touch. The mountain remembers." Petru wanted to tell him to stop talking like a priest. But he didn't. Because a man learns quick that mountains remember more than names. The bite marks came 3 days after the dog. The men found them on a stump first. A stump they cut clean with saw and wedges, straight, professional, still damp with sap. In the morning, the stump looked as if someone had taken a massive bite out of the cut surface, tearing through the rings like bread. Vogel knelt and ran a finger along the gouge. He didn't joke this time. "This is oak," he said. "Nothing chews oak." Petru looked at the bite and felt his mouth go dry. The gouge wasn't ragged. It wasn't the damage of a falling branch or a tool. It was a crescent, smooth and deep. Teeth marks. And around it, the wood was pressed and polished, as if a mouth had held it and worked carefully. Andrei tried to rationalize. Maybe a bear with rot in its teeth. Mihai cut him off. "Bears don't climb stumps with their mouths." Petru stood slowly and looked around. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind in the tops. Quiet like a held breath. He pointed toward the slope. "Work continues," he said, "because foremen say that when they're afraid, it's an incantation. But nobody cuts alone, pairs." Vogel nodded, grateful for order. Andrei looked disappointed, like part of him wanted an adventure. The mountain listened and said nothing. It didn't need to answer immediately. It had time. That night snow came heavier. The kind of snow that makes your world small and your light smaller. Inside the main hut, men ate in silence, chewing hard bread and thin stew. The fire popped, the roof creaked under the weight. And outside, past the fire's reach, the dark pressed close to the hut walls like a crowd. Petru sat near the door with his rifle across his knees, not because he thought a rifle could stop whatever had bitten oak, but because holding something solid gave his hands a job. Mihai sat opposite, staring into the flames. Finally, Andrei asked the question that had been crawling around the hut all night. "What do you call it?" he said. No one answered at first. Then Mihai spoke without looking up. "In the villages," he said, "they call it Strigoi when the dead don't stay dead." Vogel scoffed automatically, but his eyes didn't meet anyone's. "That's for children," he muttered. Mihai's voice stayed calm. "For children," he agreed, "so children don't wander into the trees at dusk." Petru frowned. "We're not in the village." Mihai lifted his eyes then, and Petru didn't like what he saw there. Not fear, certainty. "The mountain has its own village," Mihai said, "and its own dead." And then, right on the edge of their hearing, the chewing began. Soft at first, easy to blame on the hut settling. Then steady, rhythmic. Scrape, grind, scrape. Not in the hut. Outside. Close enough that Petru could feel vibration in the floorboards if he held his breath. The men froze. Vogel stood slow, as if rising quickly might trigger something. Petru lifted a hand, palm down. Quiet, he mouthed. The chewing continued, patient, confident. Not the frantic gnawing of a rat, not the tearing of a wolf. The deliberate work of teeth against wood. Then it stopped. Silence returned so sharply it felt placed there. And in that silence, something heavy shifted near the hut wall. A slow thump. As if a shoulder or a skull had leaned into the timber and tested the strength. Andrei's breathing went shallow. He covered his mouth with a hand. Petru's finger tightened near the trigger without meaning to. Then came the sound that made Vogel's face go white. A long, wet inhale. Not a sniff. An inhale that took its time, as if drawing in every scent of men and smoke and fear from the cracks between logs. Mihai whispered, barely audible. It's smelling the hunger in you. Petru wanted to deny it. He couldn't. Because in that moment, the undercurrent truth surfaced. Hunger isn't just empty stomach. Hunger is a thing that lives in men. It shapes them. It makes them predictable. And anything that can smell hunger can control you. At dawn, they found the oak. The one with bite marks climbing it like steps. Petru stood with the lantern and stared up, neck craning, trying to measure the spacing. Each bite was set higher than the last. Not random feeding. A method. A way to climb without hands. And at the top, just before the fog swallowed the trunk, the bite marks ended in a smear of bark peeled away, like something heavy had pressed its chest there and pulled itself over a branch. Andrei whispered, it climbed. Vogel swallowed. Nothing climbs like that. Mihai didn't answer. He was staring at the base of the oak. Petru followed his gaze. In the snow, there were impressions. Not footprints, not paw prints. A long trough where something had dragged itself close, and on either side of the trough, deep punctures, like toe tips or claws, set wide apart. Too wide. Too heavy. Petru measured the distance with his eyes and felt his stomach tighten. If the marks were honest, the thing that made them was broader than a cart. And it had come right up to their work line in the night and left marks like a signature. Vogel looked at Petru. We should go down, tell the buyer, bring men. Petru shook his head once. Not because he was brave. Because he understood how this would be received in the valley. A foreman returning with talk of a giant strigoi that bites oak would be laughed out of his contract. Or worse, called drunk. No men would be sent. Only another foreman. More bodies. Petru's jaw tightened. We finished the cut, he said. Even as he said it, he felt the words taste like stupidity. But the camp needed timber to justify its existence, and timber required staying. That's the other trap, economics. It keeps you in places your instincts beg you to leave. Mihai stepped closer to Petru and spoke low, so the others wouldn't hear the full weight. It marked the tree, he said. Petru frowned. Marked it for what? Mihai's eyes went to the forest line, to the slope where fog hung thicker. To show you the route, he said, so you walk where it wants. Petru felt cold travel up his spine. Because he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Those bite marks weren't feeding. They were signage. A path. A ladder. A message left at eye level for men with lanterns. And if it could leave messages, then it could plan. Petru turned to the men. No one goes beyond the last cut today, he ordered. We stay in sight, we keep the line tight. Vogel nodded. Andrei didn't like it, but he obeyed. They worked through the morning, axes and saws biting into trees with a new fear behind every strike. And every time an oak cracked and started to lean, Petru listened, not just for the crash, for a second sound, a heavier one, a sound that would mean the forest had decided to answer. Near midday, the answer came, not as a roar, as a voice, a man's voice calling from upslope through fog. Petru. Petru froze, because the voice sounded like it came from his own throat. Not the words, just the timbre, the exact roughness. Vogel stared at him. Did you? Petru shook his head slowly, eyes on the fog line. The voice called again. Petru, come see. And then beneath the voice, that slow grinding began again, teeth on wood. As if the mountain was speaking with two mouths. Mihai crossed himself. Andrei lifted his rifle with shaking hands. Petru did not move toward the voice. He did the only thing a foreman can do when the job becomes a burial. He shouted, loud enough to break the spell. Back to camp now. They retreated, not running, because running turns men into prey even when they don't believe in prey. They moved backward with eyes on the fog. The voice followed them, calling softer, closer. And the chewing kept time like a clock. By the time they reached camp, Petru understood what the bite marks in oak truly meant. The forest wasn't warning them to leave. It was teaching them where the boundary was. And boundary are only useful to something that intends to keep you inside. The camp didn't relax after the voice. It tightened. Men stopped wandering between huts without looking over their shoulders. They stopped stepping into the trees to relieve themselves. Even the simple act of fetching water from the half-frozen run became a group task, done quickly, with eyes always up the slope. Petru enforced it because rules were the only thing he had left that still belonged to humans. No one beyond the last cut. No one alone. No fire after dark except a low one, shielded, because a bright flame is a beacon in a white world. Vogel didn't argue anymore, but he kept his rifle close and his jaw clenched like he was chewing his own fear into something manageable. Andrei became quiet in a way that wasn't maturity. It was subtraction, boyhood being removed one piece at a time. Mihai salted the stew heavier than usual and said nothing, because he knew what salt was for. Not taste, but keeping meat from spoiling when you can't afford waste. That night they heard the chewing again. Not close to the wall this time. Further out. Moving. The sound traveled through the trees in a slow rhythm, sometimes fading, sometimes returning as if the thing making it was circling the camp at a measured distance. Like a man walking the edge of a property. Petru lay awake listening until the sound stopped. He didn't sleep when it stopped. Silence was the worst condition now. Silence meant it had decided where to be. At dawn, they found the second oak. Not near the work line. Near the latrine trench behind the huts, close enough that it felt like an insult. The bite marks climbed it the same way, crescent after crescent, evenly spaced, the wood fibers crushed and polished. But there was something new. Between the bites, the bark had been scraped away in long vertical strips. Not clawed. Peeled. As if something had pressed a body against the trunk and dragged upward, using its own weight like a file. Vogel stared up and whispered, "It was right here." Andrei walked to the base of the oak and stopped short. In the snow there was a line, a trough, where something had dragged itself from the trees toward the camp. Beside the trough, deep punctures again, set wide, too wide. But this time, there were two sets of punctures running parallel, as if two long-toed feet had moved on either side of the drag line. Two legs. Two legs with weight. Two legs that didn't need to hide their pressure. Petru knelt and held his lantern close to the punctures, even in daylight, because the lantern gave shape to details the mind didn't want to accept. The punctures had a strange geometry. Not hooves, not paws. Long, narrow impressions that ended in a hooked point, as if a toe had pressed down and then curled slightly before lifting. Mihai stood behind him and murmured, "It walks like a man who forgot how." Petru looked up sharply. Mihai didn't flinch. "It learns," Mihai added almost clinically, slowly. Petru stood. He looked at the huts, the stacked timber, the narrow track down toward the valley. Then he looked back at the oak. The bite marks weren't just signs of proximity. They were a measure of confidence. A thing that leaves marks in the heart of a camp is either careless or certain the camp can't leave. Petru gathered the men. He didn't call it a meeting. He didn't want that energy. Meetings are what you do when you still believe you have options. He gave orders. "We raft what's cut," he said. "We move down 2 days early. We don't wait for quota." Vogel nodded immediately, relief disguised as practicality. Andrei opened his mouth to object, then shut it again when he saw Petru's face. Mihai said quietly, "It won't let us go clean." Petru met his eyes. "Then we don't go clean," he replied. "We go alive." The work that day was ugly. Not smooth logging, not productive. It was dismantling. Breaking camp into what could be carried and dragged. Tools wrapped in cloth, flour sacks tied off, meat bundled, timber chains coiled. They began forming a sled of sorts from 2 straight poles and crosspieces, intended to drag the most valuable supplies down the slope to the river bend. Every few minutes, someone stopped and listened. Not for wolves, for chewing, for a voice, for anything that might indicate the forest had decided to oppose movement. By late afternoon, snow began again, fine and persistent, blurring edges, softening distance. Petru ordered them inside. They would leave at first light. They would not travel in falling dark. Night travel in the Carpathians turns men into a story told later. Inside the main hut, Mihai portioned food without comment. Petru watched him and saw the calculation behind every ladle. Mihai was doing what a good cook does in winter, rationing for the days he hoped existed. Andrei sat near the door, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the cracks between logs as if expecting an eye to appear there. Vogel sharpened an axe with a S. Tone slow and rhythmic. The sound should have been comforting, human work. Instead it sounded too much like chewing. Petru stopped him with a look. Vogel lowered the stone, embarrassed. Then softly from outside, the camp heard a different sound. A human cough. A rough clearing of throat. Close. Right outside the hut. Andrei stiffened. Someone's out there. Petru's mouth went dry. All men were accounted for. He held up a hand and mouthed, "No one speaks." The cough came again. Then a voice, low, familiar. "Petru." It was Petru's voice. Not similar, not close. The same timbre, the same tired rasp, the same cadence. If you've ever heard your own voice played back wrong on a recording, you know the specific sickness that produces. Now imagine hearing it outside a hut in the Carpathians, at night, in snow. The voice continued, gentle, persuasive. "Petru, open, we're cold." Mihai's lips moved silently as if praying. Vogel's eyes went wide, not with superstition, but with the sudden understanding that the thing had been listening long enough to pick a voice that would break the foreman first. Andrei whispered without meaning to, "How?" Petru snapped his head toward him, and Andrei clamped his mouth shut. The voice outside changed. Now it sounded like Andrei. Boyish, strained. "Petru, it's me, I'm hurt." Petru felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just mimicking sound. It was selecting leverage. The voice shifted again, becoming Vogel's, hard, angry. "Open the door, stop hiding." Then Mihai's voice, soft, resigned. "It's already inside you." Petru's hands tightened on the rifle. His mind did something involuntary. It started assembling a picture of each man outside, one at a time, in the dark, needing help. That is how mimicry kills you. Not by tricking your ears. By rearranging your duty. Petru leaned close to the door, lips near the crack, and spoke the smallest possible sentence. "Not to the thing. To the men. Do not answer." Silence. Then the chewing began again. Not outside the door. Under the hut. A slow grind like teeth on timber. The floorboards vibrated faintly. Dust sifted from the rafters. Vogel's face went white. "It's under us," he mouthed. Petru didn't move. He didn't give it the gift of panic. He held the rifle and listened. The chewing traveled along a beam, left to right, like something was testing where the hut's support was weakest. Then abruptly it stopped. And in the silence, something heavy pressed up from beneath. Not enough to break through. Enough to bow the floorboard a fraction. Enough to tell them the rules had changed. The hut wasn't shelter. It was material. It was food. Petru's voice came out low, flat. "At light," he whispered, "we leave no matter what." No one argued. No one slept. At first light, they stepped out into a world made of white and gray. Snow lay on everything like ash. The trees were skeletal. The camp looked smaller, meaner, less real, like it had always been temporary. They harnessed themselves to the supply sled, ropes around shoulders, boots biting into crust. Petru ordered the formation. Vogel front left with the axe. Andre front right with the rifle. Petru in the middle to call stops. Mihai rear with the lantern and the food, because if Mihai went down, the days went down. They moved. Slow at first, then steadier as the slope began to carry them. For half an hour, nothing happened. No chewing, no voices. Only the creak of rope and the rasp of boots in snow. The quiet tried to convince them that leaving was possible. Then Andre stopped. He raised a hand and pointed without speaking. On a tree ahead, another oak, there were fresh bite marks. Not one. A line of them. Not climbing upward this time. Across. Bite marks on multiple trunks at the same height, running parallel to their root like posts along a road. Petru stared and felt his skin tighten. It had marked their path in advance. It wasn't just reacting to them. It had predicted which line they'd take down the slope, because there are only so many safe lines in winter. Mihai whispered, barely audible, "It's hurting." Vogel spat into the snow. "To where?" Petru didn't answer. Because the answer began to reveal itself as they continued. The bite-marked oaks guided them toward a narrow notch between two rises, a natural choke point where trees grew close and the ground dipped into a shallow ravine. A corridor. A place where sound would echo and escape would be steep. Petru slowed the group. He looked left and right for an alternate route. The alternatives were worse: deeper snow, steeper slope, deadfall. The notch wasn't a choice. It was a funnel. If you're listening and imagining yourself there, understand the feeling. You're not walking through a forest anymore. You're walking through a design. Petru lifted his lantern even though it was day, because the ravine swallowed light. They entered. The walls of the ravine were close enough to brush with a hand. Snow clung to roots and rock. The air felt colder. And the sound changed. Not louder. More intimate. Every boot step was an announcement. Every breath was a confession. Halfway through, Vogel stopped dead. He pointed to the left wall. Scratches. Deep grooves in the bark of a beech, higher than a man could reach. And beneath the scratches, Embedded in the bark like nails were tiny splinters of oak. Wood fibers, pale and fresh, stuck to the tree as if they'd been carried there on teeth. Petru didn't like the implication. It wasn't just biting oaks. It was using oak as a tool. Carrying it, pressing it, leaving traces like a butcher leaves fat on a blade. Then the voice came again. This time it didn't come from ahead. It came from behind them, back toward the ravine entrance. A man's voice, one of the other cutters who hadn't spoken much, a name Petru barely remembered, calling in panic. Wait, wait. The voice broke, then became Andre's again. I fell, help me. Andre turned his head so fast his neck cracked. Petru grabbed his shoulder. Andre's eyes were wide, wet. That's me, Andre whispered, that's me. Petru held him hard. It's not you, he said, it's using you. The voice behind them shifted, becoming Petru's again. Stop, come back, it's safe. Vogel snarled, safe, and raised the axe as if he could cut a voice. Mihai spoke one sentence, quiet and terrible. It wants you to turn around, he said, so you see it. The chewing started. Not behind. Above. From the ravine wall, higher up, where an oak leaned out over the corridor. A slow grind of teeth into wood. Then a crack, soft, controlled, as if the tree had been weakened deliberately. The oak shifted. Snow slid off its branches in a curtain. And for one moment through that falling snow, Petru saw the shape. It wasn't perched like an animal. It was balanced like a man on a beam. Too tall, too pale. Limbs too long, joints wrong. Its head was low and forward, as if the neck had been pulled down by hunger. And the mouth. The mouth was a crescent of darkness framed by teeth that looked less like fangs and more like chisels, built for gnawing hard things. It opened slightly. The chewing sound didn't come from the teeth meeting wood anymore. It came from the creature's jaw working empty air, as if it could taste their heat from a distance. And then it smiled. Not with expression. With the mechanics of a mouth that had learned what a smile does to a man's nerves. Vogel lifted the axe and took a step forward instinctively, rage trying to become bravery. Petru shoved him back. Don't, Petru hissed, not in the funnel. The creature moved then. Not a leap. A descent. It slid down the oak trunk using the bite marks, those crescents as footholds. Step. 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 A giant thing climbing down its own teeth marks like a ladder. And that was when Petru understood the title of their horror. The bite marks weren't random feeding. They were infrastructure. The forest had been fitted with grips and steps. A network of roots only one body could use. The creature reached the base of the oak and stood in the ravine's shadow. It was taller than any man there by a full head and shoulders, taller than the tree line felt reasonable for. Its chest was broad but not muscular the way a bear is muscular. It looked emptied out, stretched over frame like winter skin over bone. Its eyes were dark hollows that didn't catch light. Its skin, what they could see of it, looked pale bark gray, mottled as if frostbite and death had taken turns with it. Mihai whispered Strigoi. The creature answered in Petru's voice. Yes. One word perfectly matched, and the men's stomachs turned because now it wasn't just mimicry. It was response. The creature tilted its head and inhaled. Long, wet, slow. As if smelling each man individually. Then it spoke again, not Petru's voice this time. A voice none of them expected to hear here. A woman's voice, old and tired. Mihai's mother, perhaps, or the memory of one. Come, it said softly, you're cold. Mihai made a strangled sound. Petru felt anger flare through him, anger at the theft of private memories. He raised his rifle. Not to shoot blindly. To aim. The creature watched the rifle come up and didn't flinch. It had seen tools before. It had likely heard shots echo in these mountains years ago and survived the noise. Petru's finger tightened. Then the creature took one step forward, slow and deliberate, and the snow under its foot compressed with a deep, heavy crunch. Andre fired. The shot cracked the ravine and sent birds exploding out of the treetops somewhere unseen. The bullet hit the creature. Petru saw a small puff of pale dust from its chest, as if something dry had been struck. The creature didn't fall. It didn't roar. It only stopped, looked down at its chest for a moment as if mildly curious. Then looked back at Andre. And smiled wider. Vogel whispered, horrified, "It's not meat." Petru understood then. They weren't dealing with a normal body. They were dealing with something preserved by cold and hunger and old superstition, something that didn't bleed the way men expect. Something that could be shot and still keep walking. The creature moved again. Faster now. Not sprinting, closing. It stepped into the ravine corridor, and the space suddenly felt too small for it. Petru shouted, "Back, back." They tried to retreat, but the sled ropes tangled, and the corridor behind them was narrow with men and supplies. The creature had chosen this place because it created clumsiness. Because fear makes hands stupid. Vogel swung the axe, not at the creature's head, too high, but at its forearm as it reached toward the sled rope. The axe hit with a dull thud, like striking wet wood. The creature's arm jerked slightly, then continued reaching. Vogel's face twisted in disbelief. Mihai grabbed a handful of salt from his pocket, meant for stew, and threw it instinctively. The salt scattered across the creature's chest and face. Nothing happened. No burning, no dramatic recoil. But the creature paused, just a fraction, and its nostrils flared harder, as if the smell of salt was information. Then it spoke again, softly in Andre's voice. "Help me." Andre made a sound like a sob. That was the final cruelty, using your own voice to make you hesitate. Petru fired. His shot hit the creature's shoulder, another puff of pale dust. The creature recoiled half a step, not from pain, but from the impact shifting its balance in the narrow ravine. Petru seized the moment. "Cut the sled," he yelled. Vogel didn't hesitate. He brought the axe down on the rope binding the sled to their shoulders. It snapped. The sled lurched backward, sliding slightly, and the supplies spilled, flour sacks, meat bundles, tools clattering. A sacrifice. The creature's head snapped toward the spilled food. Not because it was hungry in the simple way. Because hunger is reflex. The creature lunged for the sacks, grabbing them with long hands and hauling them toward itself like a man grabbing a drowning child. And that gave the men 3 seconds. Petru shoved Andre and Mihai toward the ravine's far end. "Run," he shouted, breaking his own rule because the rule had changed. They ran. Boots slipping, breath tearing, rifles banging against ribs. Behind them, the creature's chewing resumed, loud now, wet and violent, teeth ripping into sack and dried meat, crushing it with a speed that made the men gag even as they ran. The sound followed them like a chain. And above it, the creature spoke once more in Petru's voice, almost amused. "Good." As if this had been the point. To make them drop supplies. To teach them what to sacrifice. To teach them that the forest owned the route. They reached the ravine exit and spilled into open slope, lungs burning. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of their original camp clearing. And when they looked back, they didn't see it chasing. They saw it standing at the ravine mouth, half in shadow, holding a flour sack in one hand like a prize. It raised the sack to its mouth and bit through cloth as if it were skin. Then it tilted its head, listening. Not to the forest. To them. as if measuring how far panic carried. Mihai collapsed to his knees and retched. Andrei sat in the snow, shaking, rifle useless in his lap. Vogel stood with the axe hanging from his hand, staring at the creature with a look that wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. Petru looked at the camp, then at the slope down toward the river. They had lost most supplies. They had lost the sled. They had lost time. And the creature had learned something, too. It had learned that men will drop everything to escape. So next time, it wouldn't need to fight. It would only need to position itself where the drop would be fatal. Petru spoke, voice hoarse. "We leave," he said. Vogel swallowed. "With what?" Petru looked at the huts, at the remaining tools, at the thin line of smoke from yesterday's fire. "With what we can carry," he said, "and with no more mistakes." Mihai lifted his head slowly. "It wanted us to run," he whispered. Petru nodded. "Yes," he said, "so now we do the one thing it didn't plan for." Andrei blinked, confused. "What?" Petru's eyes went to the camp's edge. To the stacked timber. To the rope coils. To the resin barrels used for sealing and waterproofing. He spoke the next words like he was reading them off a ledger. "We burn the camp," he said. "We burn the stores, we burn the smell." Vogel stared. "That's madness." Petru shook his head. "No," he replied, "that's starvation." He paused, then added, quieter, because this was the part that made him feel like a man betraying his own work. "We stop feeding it." The wind shifted, the fog line moved. And, from somewhere upslope, very faintly, came the chewing again, slower now, satisfied. As if it approved of the lesson. Petru didn't give them time to argue. He knew what hesitation would do in that clearing. It would become a second campfire, something the creature could gather around without being seen. "Axes," he said. "Resin, lantern oil, everything that burns." Vogel stared at him like he'd asked for a limb. "This is our pay," Vogel said, voice raw. "This is the contract." Petru looked at the huts, at the stacked timber, at the smoke stains on the rafters, at the food stores that were already too light. Then he looked upslope, toward the ravine mouth, where the fog held a shape the way a fist holds a stone. "The contract is dead," Petru said. "We're negotiating with the mountain now." Mihai nodded once, already moving. He understood the logic because cooks learn it earlier than men who swing axes. If you keep feeding a hunger, it becomes your master. They worked fast. Not efficiently, fear ruins efficiency, but decisively. Resin barrels rolled out. Oil tins came from the tool hut. Kindling and shavings were piled into corners under bunks along hut walls. Petru kept his rifle in his hands and his eyes on the tree line. Because burning the camp meant noise. It meant light. It meant a smell that would travel. And if the creature truly smelled hunger, if it read scent the way a foreman reads tracks, then it would smell the act of denial as clearly as it had smelled their stew. Andrei kept glancing uphill, shaking, like his body still expected the creature to step out of the ravine and finish the lesson. Vogel set his jaw and did what Petru asked, because when a man has already swung an axe at something and watched it ignore the strike, he stops pretending there are clean solutions. They lit the first hut. The flame caught resin and jumped up the wall with a hungry speed that made Petru flinch despite himself. Smoke rolled into the air in a thick, dark column. One by one, the huts began to burn. The fire didn't just consume wood. It consumed comfort. It turned the camp, everything familiar, everything that had kept them human for weeks, into a black silhouette and then into collapsing sparks. Mihai stood watching for a moment, eyes reflecting flame. He spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular. "Now it must hunt," he said, "not feed." Petru didn't answer, because he knew the other side of that truth. A hungry thing that is forced to hunt becomes inventive. They left the camp before the roofs collapsed. Not because they were afraid of fire. Because they were afraid of staying in one place long enough for the creature to decide how to use the fire against them. They took only what they could carry. One pot, one sack of flour that hadn't been spilled, 2 water skins, a small wrapped bundle of smoked meat, axe, rope, and Petru's lantern. Everything else burned. The trail down toward the river was their only hope of reaching the valley before exhaustion made choices for them. Snow continued to fall, but the fire's heat created a brief pocket of clearer air around the clearing. For the first time in days, Petru could see further into the forest line. He wished he couldn't. Between 2 trees upslope, at the edge of the fog, a pale shape stood watching the camp burn. Not rushing, not recoiling, just present, as if it was observing an experiment. The Strigoi Colossus didn't move toward the flames. It didn't need to. Fire didn't threaten its existence, it threatened its supply. Petru raised his rifle, aiming not at its chest but at its head, and the creature tilted its own head slightly in response. Not flinching, acknowledging. Then it spoke once in a voice that made Petru's stomach knot. Not Petru's voice. Not Andrei's. A voice from below the mountains. The timber buyer's voice, perhaps, flat, impatient, carried from memory. "You'll come back," it said. "You always come back." Petru felt Andrei stiffen beside him. Mihai exhaled through his nose like a man smelling spoiled meat. Vogel's axe tightened in his grip. Petru lowered the rifle a fraction. The creature didn't advance. It simply turned, slow and smooth, and disappeared into fog as if the fog had been waiting to swallow it. And that was almost worse than pursuit. Because it meant it didn't need to chase them openly. It meant it believed the route would do the rest. They walked until dusk. The slope down toward the river should have been straightforward, but winter transforms straightforward into deceptive. What looks like a gentle descent becomes a patchwork of hidden ice and deadfall. What looks like a shortcut becomes a ravine that forces you into a corridor. Petru kept them off obvious lines. He avoided narrow notches. He avoided stands of oaks whenever possible, not because oaks were dangerous on their own, but because oaks had become language. Every bite mark was a word. Every crescent was a signpost. And Petru refused, as long as he could, to read what the mountain was trying to write. They stopped briefly near a rock outcrop where the wind cut less. Mihai gave each man a bite of meat the size of a thumb and a sip of water. It wasn't enough to feel like a meal. It was enough to keep your body from beginning its own negotiations with hunger. And hunger, Petru had learned, was a channel the creature could use. As darkness thickened, they started again. Night travel was terrible, but staying still was worse. The fire's smoke column behind them was now a beacon. If the creature was anywhere in the country, it could find the direction of that smoke. If there were other things like it, the smoke would be an invitation. They walked by lantern, and by the dim pale glow snow gives off when clouds reflect what little starlight exists. And then the mimicry returned. Not from one direction. From many. At first it was just a whisper in the trees. A soft Andrei from somewhere to their left. Andrei stopped mid-step, face turning toward the sound like a man hearing his own name in church. Petru grabbed his coat and yanked him forward. "Don't," Petru said. Andrei swallowed. It sounded like. "It's supposed to," Mihai murmured behind them. A second whisper came from the right. "Vogel." Vogel didn't turn his head. He kept walking, but his shoulders went rigid. Then Petru's voice, Petru's exact voice, came from behind them, from the dark they had just walked through. "Stop, rest, you're safe." Petru felt cold anger flare. It wasn't just copying sound. It was trying to introduce permission, the most lethal commodity in the mountains. The voices continued for hours, never loud enough to locate, never close enough to shoot, always selecting the soft spot in each man and pressing it. For Andrei, it used helplessness. For Vogel, it used pride. For Mihai, it used family, his mother's voice, his father's voice, dead voices that had no business walking through snow. And for Petru, it used responsibility. Foreman, you left them. You left the camp, you left the men. Petru kept walking, jaw clenched until it ached, because if he responded even once, he knew the creature would learn something more than his voice. It would learn his rhythm, how he inhaled before speaking, how he hesitated before a lie, how fear sounded inside his throat. Near midnight, they found an old cutting line. A stretch of forest that had been worked years ago, stumps black with age, saplings grown in tight clusters. The ground here was flatter, the snow was less deep. Petru didn't like how easy it felt. Ease in the mountains is often a trap disguised as mercy. They moved through it anyway, because exhaustion had begun to speak louder than caution. That's when Mihai stopped. He held the lantern low and stared at the snow near a stump. Petru stepped back toward him. What? Mihai pointed. In the snow there were bite marks. Not on a tree. On a piece of wood lying on the ground. A plank old and gray, perhaps from a collapsed hut. And the plank had been chewed into the same crescents, the same clean half-moons, as the oaks. Vogel leaned in, frowning. It's practicing, he said, voice low. Petru felt his stomach drop. Yes, practicing. On dead wood before biting live. Maintaining teeth, keeping shape, keeping strength. Then they saw more. A trail of chewed planks leading deeper into the old cutting line. Not random debris. Arranged. Placed. Like breadcrumbs. Mihai whispered, it wants us to follow. Petru looked at the men. Andrei's eyes were glassy with fatigue. Vogel's breath steamed hard, his body running on anger and habit. Petru understood something he'd been avoiding. They were no longer choosing routes, they were choosing between traps. The forest had been worked before. That meant there were abandoned huts, collapsed store sheds, old tools. Human scent soaked into wood even after years. And where human scent lingers, hunger lingers. Petru turned away from the chewed trail. No, he said. He led them off the cutting line into deeper snow. It was slower, harder, but it was unwritten country. For now, they didn't see the creature again, until the moment it wanted to be seen. It happened near the river bend at dawn. The valley opened slightly there, a narrow ribbon of dark water cutting between banks of ice and stone. The river was not fully frozen. It moved under a skin of thin ice in places, black and quiet in others. In the summer, timber rafts could be sent down from this bend. In winter, it was still their best line downhill. Follow the river and you eventually reach men. If you can stay alive long enough. Petru stopped at the bank and lowered the lantern. He listened. Water spoke in its own way, and this water sounded wrong, muted, as if something in the channel was blocking flow intermittently. Vogel squinted downriver. There, he said. Across the bend, a fallen oak lay partially in the river, trunk spanning bank to bank like a crude bridge. It hadn't fallen naturally. The bria was too clean, the trunk angled too deliberately. And along its bark, even from this distance, Petru could see pale crescents. Bite marks. A ladder. A walkway. A bridge built out of teeth. Mihai's voice came out thin. It made a crossing. Petru nodded. And it wants us to use it. Andrei stared at the oak bridge like a man staring at a noose that's been decorated. "We can't cross the water," Andre said, fear sharpening him. "We'll freeze." Petru looked at the river, then at the bridge, then at the narrow banks where ice made stepping off the bridge difficult. It was a funnel again, a corridor, a place where you can't turn quickly. Petru made a decision that wasn't bravery, just unwillingness to be directed. "We go along the bank," he said, "not across." Vogel's jaw tightened. "The bank is ice." Petru nodded. "Then we walk like men," he replied, "not like bait." They began moving along the near bank, boots careful on ice-crusted stones. For 50 yards, nothing happened. Then the voice came, not whispering in the trees this time. Right in front of them, from the fog that hovered low over the river. "Petru." Petru stopped. The voice sounded like a man they'd lost earlier in the season, one of the cutters who'd gone down to the valley for supplies and never returned. A name that had become a shrug because that's how men survive loss in winter, by compressing it. "Petru," the voice said again, closer, "come." And then the fog moved, and the creature stepped out onto the oak bridge. It stood on the trunk as if it weighed nothing, as if it belonged on that line. It was taller in the open than it had seemed in the ravine, because now the landscape gave it scale. Its limbs looked too long for its frame, its shoulders broad, its torso stretched and narrow like hunger had pulled it into shape. Its mouth worked slowly, chewing empty air. And its teeth, those chisel-like teeth, were pale and thick, set in a crescent that looked built for gnawing timber and bone with the same indifference. Vogel raised the axe. Andre raised the rifle. Petru lifted his own rifle and aimed higher. The creature's head tilted. It spoke softly, in Mihai's mother's voice again. "Come home." Mihai made a small broken noise and stepped back, shaking his head. Petru saw the creature's eyes, dark hollows that didn't shine, that didn't reflect, as if there was nothing in them to catch light. He felt something in himself, recognized it the way a prey animal recognizes a predator. Not by sight, by certainty. The creature took one step forward along the oak trunk. The trunk didn't flex. Those bite marks weren't just steps. They were grips, places where claws could lock. A structure designed for its body. It had turned the river into a controlled crossing. Then it did something worse than stepping forward. It stopped and waited. Because it understood now that men will choose the safer option themselves. They would choose the bank. They would choose the ice. They would choose the narrow line where one slip ends the argument. The creature didn't need to chase. It only needed to be present, like a gate. Petru whispered to Vogel, "Don't swing." Vogel's eyes flashed, "It's right there." Petru's voice stayed low, "It wants you close." Andre's rifle trembled. "Shoot it," Andre whispered. Petru shook his head. "We already did," he said, and it smiled. The creature's mouth opened slightly. A sound came out, not a roar, not a scream. A slow grind like teeth on oak. Then it spoke again, this time in Petru's own voice, calm, familiar. "You're tired." Petru felt nausea, not from fear but from violation. The creature was wearing his cadence like a coat. Petru tightened his grip on the rifle, and did the only thing he could think of that the creature might not have mapped yet. He looked away from it. He looked at the riverbank stones, at the ice, at the path, and he spoke loud enough for his men to hear, but not as an answer to the creature, more like an order to his own body. "We break the bridge," he said. Vogel blinked. "With what?" Petru pointed at the trunk. "The oak," he said. "It bit it, it weakened it." Vogel's eyes narrowed. He understood at once. The same method the creature used to control roots could be turned against it, if you had the nerve to stand close enough to do it. Petru pointed at the far end of the trunk where it met the bank. Axe's there, he said. Now. Vogel hesitated only a heartbeat, then moved along the bank, stepping onto stones, skirting ice. Andrei moved with him, rifle still trained on the creature. Mihai stayed near Petru, lantern held low. The creature watched them shift. It didn't rush. It waited to see whether they'd commit. Then it spoke in Andrei's voice, high, frightened. Don't. Andrei flinched mid-step, as if his own voice had snagged his spine. Petru grabbed his sleeve and yanked him forward. Move, Petru hissed. Vogel arched, each the trunk's bank connection, and swung his axe into the oak. The blade bit. The oak rang with a dull sound like hitting frozen meat. Vogel swung again. Wood chips flew. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Its mouth opened wider. The chewing accelerated. Not at the air. At the oak beneath its feet. It began to chew its own bridge, faster than any animal should be able to chew, teeth grinding and crushing wood into pulp. It wasn't trying to save the bridge. It was trying to control the timing of its collapse. If it could drop the trunk when men were in the wrong place, it could turn the river into a weapon. Vogel chopped harder. Andrei fired, one shot aiming at the creature's knee. The bullet hit and produced that same puff of pale dust. The creature didn't fall, but its leg shifted slightly, balance corrected. Mihai whispered, "It's dead wood." Petru nodded, grim. It wasn't flesh as men understood flesh. It was something winter preserved, something bark-skinned, hunger-built. The bridge groaned. A deep crack ran through the oak, not from Vogel's axe alone, but from the creature's teeth meeting his effort. Two forces working the same material from different sides. For one moment, Petru thought they might actually break it with the creature still on it. Then the creature did the simplest, cruelest thing. It stepped off the trunk onto the far bank, moving with a sudden speed that made Petru's eyes stutter. It didn't need the bridge anymore. It had used it to trap them into focusing on the wrong goal. Now it was on the far side, and its presence there blocked the route they had to take downriver. A gate moved from one hinge to another. Vogel froze, axe raised. Andrei's rifle aimed, but his arms shook with exhaustion. The creature inhaled. Long, wet, slow. Then it spoke in Petru's voice again, almost gentle. You can't go around. Petru felt the truth of it. The river bend was narrow, the banks were steep, the ice was treacherous, the woods above were deep snow and choke points. The creature had chosen this bend because it offered only one clean route past. A route it could occupy like a toll. Mihai's voice trembled. What does it want? Petru stared at the creature's mouth. He answered without romance. It wants hunger, he said. It wants us to become it. Vogel spat, furious. Then we feed it fire. Petru looked at their bundle. They had no camp, no barrels, no resin. But they had one thing the creature respected enough to watch carefully. The lantern. The flame. Mihai held it like a heart. Petru made his choice. He handed his rifle to Andrei. Hold it steady, he said. Andrei blinked. What are you doing? Petru pulled the small cloth-wrapped bundle of remaining meat from Mihai's pack. He tore it open, exposed it to the cold, and then took the lantern from Mihai. Mihai's eyes widened. Petru. Petru didn't answer. He soaked the meat bundle with lantern oil, wasting precious fuel, until it stank. Then he lit it. The oil caught and the bundle became a small, fierce torch, flames snapping in the wind. Petru held it out toward the creature. Not to attack. To offer. The creature's head tilted. Its nostrils flared. Its mouth opened slightly. It stepped forward one pace. Petru felt Andrei tense behind him. Petru raised his free hand, palm back, don't shoot. because he understood something Mihai had hinted at earlier. It smelled hunger. If you offered it something that smelled like food, real food burning made urgent, it would respond. It did. The creature stepped closer, slow and deliberate, drawn to the burning meat like an instinct made visible. Its teeth clicked once. Petru held the flaming bundle steady, arms shaking from cold and fear. When the creature leaned in, Petru threw the burning bundle, not at its face but at its chest. The flame struck its bark gray skin and clung for a second, licking. The creature recoiled, not screaming, but stepping back sharply as if its body remembered fire in an old, deep way. And in that recoil, Petru moved. He grabbed Mihai's lantern, still lit, and hurled it at the oak bridge. The glass shattered. Oil spread along the trunk. Flame ran quick, bright, consuming the bite-marked steps. The bridge became a line of fire between them and the creature. A boundary the creature could not cross without paying in pain. The creature stood on the far bank, watching the fire take its infrastructure. Its mouth worked slowly, chewing empty air. Then it spoke once, in a voice that was not any of theirs, something older, rougher. A language that sounded like stones rubbing. The men didn't understand the words, but they understood the meaning. You will be hungry again. Petru turned to his men. Now, he said. They moved along the near bank while the bridge burned, using the fire as a shield, following the river's curve down toward the valley. The creature didn't chase through flame. It didn't need to. It simply walked parallel on the far bank at a distance, visible through fog in broken glimpses. A tall, pale silhouette moving with patience, keeping pace, waiting for the moment the fire died, waiting for the moment hunger returned. They walked the rest of that day like men, walking away from their own names. No jokes, no talk, only the occasional command, step there, not there, and the constant sound of water beside them. By late afternoon, they saw signs of the valley. A faint track, old sled grooves, a broken fence post half buried in snow. Humanity returned in fragments. And with it came the strangest feeling. Not relief. Exposure. Because up here fear had been focused, it had a shape. Down here fear could spread. It could become rumor. It could become disbelief. Near dusk, they reached a small outpost, 2 huts, a timber yard, a man with a dog who stared at them as if ghosts had walked out of the river mist. The dog growled low and refused to come near. The man, older, bearded, eyes sharp, asked the obvious question. Where's your timber? Petru looked at him and found that the answer didn't matter. He said instead, don't go up. The man scoffed, up where? Petru pointed with a trembling hand toward the invisible line of the timber line. The oaks, Petru said. If you see bite marks, you turn around. The man frowned, the first crack in his certainty. What bit oak? Vogel answered before Petru could. Something that can chew your house if it wants. The man stared at them for a long moment, then finally stepped aside and let them in. Inside, by a small fire, Mihai drank water and shook like a man thawing from the inside out. Andrei sat in a corner, eyes fixed on the door, listening for voices that weren't there. Vogel kept his axe on his lap, as if it was a child he couldn't set down. Petru spoke to the outpost man, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. He told him what happened, but he kept it practical. Missing food, bite marks, voices, the ravine, the bridge. He didn't say Strigoi at first. He didn't want superstition to give the thing dignity. But the outpost man said it himself eventually, quietly, as if naming it might bring it closer. Strig, he murmured, or something older. Petru didn't correct him. Because the name wasn't the point. The behavior was. That night, the outpost man wrote a short note to the timber buyer in the valley, cold business language. Camp lost, route unsafe, men returned without stores, recommend suspension of upper cut lines. No mention of a creature. No mention of bite marks. Just unsafe. As if the mountain were a broken tool. Petru read the note and understood how this would go. The buyer would send another foreman. A harder one. A man who believed fear was weakness. And the mountain would teach him the same lesson. Or worse. Petru stayed in the valley for 2 weeks. Long enough for the shakes to fade. Long enough for his hands to stop smelling smoke. Long enough for him to try sleeping without hearing chewing under floorboards. He failed. At night in a warm room he still heard it, a slow grinding in the timber beams, not real sound but memory. And sometimes, just before dawn, he thought he heard his own voice outside the window. Soft. Persuasive. Petru. He never answered. He became a man who didn't answer voices in the night, even when the voice sounded like love. And that is what the mountains leave you with, not a scar you can show, but a rule you cannot break. They asked him to go back up in spring, to locate the abandoned tools, to salvage what was left. He refused. Men laughed, called him coward, called him drunk. He let them, because cowardice is a word people use when they've never watched a thing chew oak like bread. The last time Petru went near the foothill road, he saw a cart returning from the upper lines. No timber. Just men quiet, avoiding each other's eyes. And on the side of the cart, nailed as a crude joke or a crude warning, was a strip of oak bark. On the bark were crescent marks. Fresh. Clean. Like a smile. Petru kept walking. Because he finally understood what the bite marks were always meant to say. The forest doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you to take the route it has prepared. And when winter hunger learns how men move, it doesn't starve. It organizes.